Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited to have you here in the Business by Nature webinar on preparing for the nature transition, practical insights from African businesses. My name is Oluwa Shuto, but you can call me Sho or Shuto. I am the Africa lead for Business by Nature, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. You can move on to the second slide. So for those who are not yet familiar with Business for Nature, we are a global coalition of over 100 partners across the world. We have over 16 partners in Africa, and our mission is to activate and accelerate the transition to a nature-positive economy by 2030. So if you are a nonprofit business association, business members, or you are an organization with a business network and you align with our mission and would like to join as a partner, please do get in touch. And my colleague has just posted in the chat how to do so. You can move on to the next slide. So for some context, a few months ago, we went out with a survey, and this was to understand some of the key nature-related gaps in understanding or challenges that are faced by African businesses. So this webinar is designed to help address some of those questions and issues. And in general, we know that everybody has a different approach and understanding to nature. So in this webinar, we're going to be covering the basics and going through some of the common questions to make sure that we can all come up to speed. So in the next hour, we'll be covering all of the key content, and we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So as you can see here, we have 4 parts. We will start off with the CEO of Business for Nature, Eva Zabey, and she will be taking us through the global overview on why nature is important for businesses. And then I will talk through some of the resources and guidance available that we have developed. Then we will have 2 panels. The first one will be with our partners in Africa Natural Capital Alliance and the Africa Wildlife Foundation. And then secondly, we'll be having a panel with 2 of the businesses in our network, Sappi and Safaricom. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And that is what we'll be using to select questions that we will address at the end of the webinar. And then some questions can also be addressed directly in the Q&A box by some of my colleagues. So now I'm going to hand over to Eva to take us through her presentation on why nature, why now.
Thank you so much, Sho. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you for taking your precious time. Now, before I get into the questions of why nature, why now, I think it's probably a good idea just to make sure we clarify what we mean by nature. It sounds pretty basic, but when people hear the word nature, they sometimes think of bird watching or going on a safari. Of course, these are part of nature. But what we're talking about is a lot more fundamental, essential, and life-giving. When we say nature, we're referring to the entire natural world, and that includes the natural capital, the processes, the natural phenomena like freshwater, air, the weather, oceans, forests. It includes the services that ecosystems provide, like water filtration, pollination, climate regulation, erosion control. How many more can I say? There are many, many others. And nature can be understood, though, through the 4 realms upon which all life on Earth depends. And they are freshwater, land, oceans, and the atmosphere, which also includes climate. And finally, biodiversity is within nature, the variability within species, between species, and between ecosystems. And the more biodiversity and nature we have, the more resilient our systems are. So it's helpful to use this framing that comes from the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures of these structuring to help us understand nature in its beauty. So nature is all around us, and we ourselves are part of nature, but sometimes we don't realize the full value of nature, or we don't feel the impact of nature loss until major natural disasters or business losses occur. And that's why we need to keep in mind that nature is truly everyone's business. Every business from every sector, every geography, of every size, not only impacts, but depends on nature. In fact, the whole economy relies on nature with half of the world's GDP being moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. For example, businesses rely on ecosystem services like freshwater, energy, raw materials, soil health. How many more am I going to say? All of these different services that nature provides. And that's what you need to be able to produce goods and services. But businesses also impact nature. They are contributing to nature loss, and nature is now at a tipping point. Globally, we have the supply chains for the food, energy, infrastructure, and fashion industries. Collectively, those industries are behind more than 90% of man-made pressure on nature. And that pressure has implications for the global economy. The World Bank estimates that ecosystem degradation could lead to global GDP losses of up to $2.7 trillion annually. So I'm really looking forward to later on in the webinar hearing from speakers who will place these issues within the African context, and also who will elaborate on how nature decline is impacting the continent and the businesses that operate within it. So thankfully, despite geopolitical headwinds, the world is still and has been waking up to the risks of nature loss. Nature is now rising on the political and regulatory agenda across the world, and I'll highlight some of the ways we're seeing this globally and also in Africa. So first, starting with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, they came up with a global biodiversity framework. 196 countries in 2022 adopted this ambitious global biodiversity framework. You can think of it as the Paris Climate Agreement equivalent for nature. And what's really special about it is that it's a framework for all. It brings together all parts of society around the global nature positive goal, which means we've got to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. We have to have more nature in 2030 than we had in 2020. And we can't do that without business. Businesses have a critical role to play to implement all of the 23 targets that governments adopted. But there's one specific target, target 15, that is a really helpful hook for the business community because it calls on businesses and financial institutions to assess and disclose their nature-related impacts, dependencies, and risks, as well as take actions to address nature loss. So with that trigger, businesses can expect changes in regulations, and they need to start getting ready to adopt them to make sure that they have their long-term success by navigating shifting market demands and also compliance expectations. We're going to hear from Dorothy in a bit, Dorothy Maseke, who's an absolute superstar. A report from the Africa Natural Climate Alliance showed that an economic transition aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework would lower physical risks and also introduce transition risks if businesses fail to adjust. And sectors like agriculture could be hit the hardest, with profit losses reaching up to 44% in some countries. So speaking also of the regulatory changes, this is already on the rise. You may have come across the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, which was established by the IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. They released 2 standards which are focused on sustainability and climate disclosures and fully relate to nature as well. And they were designed to support investors' decision-making, because investors are now increasingly looking at how sustainability-related challenges could affect a company's financial performance. Very interestingly, and good to see the convergence, is that ISSB is aligned with the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Global Reporting Initiative. And they're 2 of the sustainability reporting frameworks that are growing in popularity across the continent. We also know that ISSB standards are being promoted in several African countries, and in countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Kenya. We're seeing mandatory adoption of these sustainability standards, which is either currently in place or will be within the next 2 or 3 years. And it's great to see colleagues on the line from these countries. So with all of these changes, addressing nature loss is no longer an option. It's not a nice to have. We absolutely need to transition to a nature positive economy. But what do we mean by nature positive? Nature positive is a collective global goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, measured from a baseline of 2020. As I said before, it means we need to have more nature in 2030 than we had in 2020. And this will be possible through increasing the health, the abundance, the diversity, and the resilience of the species, the populations, the ecosystems. So we really need to make sure we get nature on this path to recovery because it sustains all of us, our livelihoods, our businesses, and economies. But that will mean a concerted effort across governments, businesses, all parts of society. And it does require a fundamental shift in how we protect, restore, and use natural resources, and that we need to embed the value of nature in our decision-making and disclosure. There are really great opportunities. This is not just a risk story. There are new opportunities to generate revenue, reduce costs, mitigate the risks, and several African countries are already leading the way, which is fantastic to see. You're showing how this can be done. One example is the Seychelles that launched the world's first sovereign blue bond and raised $15 million. And in 2023, Gabon issued Africa's first debt for nature swap for $500 million. And 5 more African nations are preparing to follow suit. So we're showing, there's research from UNEP, the environment program, that shows that every dollar invested in restoration creates up to $30 in economic benefits. But if ecosystem services collapse, sub-Saharan Africa could face nearly over $350 billion in economic losses. So we go back to the story of resilience. The long-term resilience and continued success of companies really depends on a healthy planet, and businesses have a crucial role to play. The question is, what would this look like? And to answer that question, it's my pleasure to hand back to Sho to take us through the answer. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Eva. Really helpful to have that global overview and see what's at stake. So in terms of what would it look like for businesses to contribute to this goal of a nature positive economy, otherwise called a nature journey, the journey that they take towards this goal, what would that look like? The first thing is it's always going to look different. So as Eva mentioned, there's a role for every business to play regardless of size or sector. And although the differences in how it looks like exactly is going to be different, there are 4 key high-level actions that businesses can take. And you can see here on the screen. So the first step would be to assess, so to measure and to value your most material impacts and dependencies on nature. And then secondly, it is to commit by setting science-based targets for nature, and based on that to transform your business models and operations based on these commitments. And then finally, to disclose material nature-related information. And the reason it's a circle is because there's, like I said, it's a journey. So we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And the key thing is for every company to take some action, but using this framework. So in the second panel with Sappi and Safaricom, you'll see how they are doing it specifically. If you want to learn more about Act D, you can click on the link that my colleague just shared in the chat. Now, before we go on, I would love to hear from you. So in the next slide, we are actually going to be having a poll. And my colleague is going to bring up a poll looking at whether your organization or company is taking action. So we would love for you to fill this out. Okay, I'm seeing that a lot of people are already answering. This is an anonymous poll, so you can be as honest as possible. Yeah, we want to make sure that we are, like I said, addressing the questions and the interests of the people online. Okay, it's coming up quickly. Just a few more people. Okay. I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. And yeah. Okay, can you all see the results? Okay, so based on this poll, most people have said that they already are taking action on nature, but there are a few that haven't started yet or wants to take action, but are not sure yet. So again, thank you for your honesty. In the next slide, we're going to go through some of the resources that we have created to help you out. So essentially, regardless of whether you've already started taking action or you want to take action and don't know where to start, we would recommend grounding all of this action within a nature strategy. So a nature strategy could be part of an existing ESG framework or sustainability plan, or it could be a targeted approach to address material nature-related issues. If you're not sure how to create a nature strategy, we have the Nature Strategy Handbook, which you can see on the screen. And then in the next slide, you can find out how to submit your nature strategy and be part of our campaign called Now for Nature. So we have featured about 30 nature strategies so far from different countries, different sectors. So if you would like to know, okay, what would a nature strategy for a renewable energy company look like, for example, you can check it out there. And if you would like to be an example for others, then you can submit your strategy and it will be reviewed. And if it meets all the criteria, it will be accepted. So in the next slide, I will also talk through the sector actions. So these sector actions are for companies that again, may not know where to start. So if you are thinking, okay, we're not tourism or we're not agriculture, which is directly dependent on nature, we are a tech company, for example, and you're not sure how it's relevant, then the sector actions can walk you through how your sector is dependent on nature, how it impacts nature, and what are the key steps to take. My colleague will also be posting a link in the chat for you to know more about nature strategies and the sector actions. But we can now move on to the first panel, actually, which I am very, very much looking forward to. So in this panel, we are joined by Dorothy Maseke and Andrea Athanas. So I'm going to start with Dorothy. Dorothy is the head of the Africa Natural Capital Alliance that Eva mentioned earlier, and this is the collaborative forum that is mobilizing the financial community's response to nature loss in Africa. In only a few years, the Africa Natural Capital Alliance has grown, and the membership here is now dozens of financial institutions and some of the most important private sector players across the continent. And so just as Eva was saying, nature as a topic is becoming a lot more important. And I think that is why the existence and the growth of ANCA is something that we are seeing more and more every day. However, I think this greater attention that nature is getting, there's some pushback against it. And so in this webinar, I actually want to address some of those questions and some of the questions that come up when we're talking about nature. So first of all, a lot of people would say Africa should not be focusing on nature. We should be focusing on economic development, on jobs, on livelihoods. And there's this assumption that we already have so much nature. We have trees, we have birds, we have all these different fauna and flora. So why are we even having this discussion today? And so I would like to come to you, Dorothy. Great to see you online. So I would love you to address this question. So how accurate is this perception that nature is abundant? We are fine in Africa when it comes to nature. So is this really true? How much nature is there in Africa, first of all, and is it at risk?
You know, Sho, you just become very excited when you speak of Africa. So it's really a pleasure and an honor to be, in this webinar this afternoon. And thank you for the very kind introduction about ANCA. We are currently at around 117 members from across the continent. And it's been a very interesting couple of years just seeing institutions begin to understand nature and, more importantly, begin to look at nature in the context of the significant opportunities that we have in Africa. So, directly to your question, Africa is blessed with a lot of natural capital. 30% of the world's minerals come from Africa. 65% of the world's arable land. 25% of global biodiversity. And of course, you all know we have the world's second largest rainforest. But as you know, the risks are also there. Because when you talk about the risk side, you're speaking of, African communities being at around 70% who directly rely on woodlands and forests. And 62% of Africa's GDP, being moderately or highly dependent on nature. So, when you said, why focus on nature and why Africa? We need to focus on economic development and food and all these things. We cannot focus on any of those things if we don't place nature at the center of, strategies, at the center of national policies, at the center of business policies, at the center of financial decision making. Nature doesn't have, the fact that we have so much nature in Africa, like I said, does not mean we should waste it, because we are dependent on this natural capital. And the more we protect it, the more we sustainably use it, the more prosperous and more resilient our economies become. And so just looking at the losses, Africa loses around $195 billion annually of its natural capital through, illicit financial flows, illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal trade in wildlife, unregulated fishing, environmental degradation and losses, and many others. And what, individuals and businesses fail to see is that we may not necessarily see the immediate results of this, but the beauty about nature is that it's very localized. Whenever I speak to my colleagues and, my friends, and, we are reminiscing the olden days, and we are not as old, but when you listen even to, our parents speak, and they say things like, we used to swim in this river, but that river doesn't exist anymore. Or, this place used to be a forest, and all of a sudden it's now a concrete jungle. I sit out of Nairobi, and we've been having, a couple of weeks ago, it was so hot at night, and the scientists in the room, I'm not a scientist myself, but would tell you of all this phenomenon about, I don't know, they call it urban heating, syndrome, or, the concrete jungle just making, where we stay becomes extremely hot, and especially, maybe at night. And the beauty about this localized effect is that it then makes us realize the need for immediate action. But still, some people don't see. We don't see that when landslides happen, it's as a direct result of, loss of trees or deforestation, because you're losing the trees that would essentially have secured the soil. Doctors will tell you that newborn babies are now being born with microplastics in their veins. We can't even imagine what that means, from, funny diseases and cancers coming through. And there are various claims that scientists have made. We don't think of plastic pollution, for example, we have plastic clogging waterways, and then we see, urban flooding. We see stagnant pools of water, perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes, for example, which spread disease. So there is a very strong linkage between, of course, nature and even health and well-being and all that. And the risk of disruption that is posed by biodiversity is staggering. And I talked about, the dependence being around 62% of Africa's GDP. Now, when you look at all these things, why is it important? It's important because all these aspects have direct consequences for businesses. where you have soil fertility issues, where you have, I mean, direct results of reduced yields due to soil fertility issues coming through. All these affect operations, they affect supply chains, they affect overall business continuity. For example, businesses that depend on freshwater resources would most likely suffer as a result of lack of access to fresh water. And so you're looking at your manufacturing plants. You're looking at, the food business. You're looking at, in Kenya, and I'll give that example, where you have all these greenhouses that that at the end of the day provide a great supply chain to many supermarkets across the globe. And suddenly the rivers that are feeding, or the rivers that are being used for irrigation, suddenly run dry. You see a direct result. And some of these greenhouses or some of these horticultural farms are spending thousands of dollars, or hundreds of thousands of dollars just looking for alternative water sources. So I hope that answers the question, Shu. It is a risk, and indeed businesses are struggling, financial institutions are seeing this, and it's something that we actually need to do and need to get to the table to address.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dorothy. I really liked how you spoke about also the local aspect and the fact that nature loss is not something that we need to think about only as a long-term issue, but something that is affect people here and now today. So now I'm going to move on to Andrea. Andrea is the Vice President for Enterprise and Investment at the Africa Wildlife Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with the AWF, it is an Africa-based global conservation organization that's protecting wildlife and their habitats as part of a modern and prosperous Africa, kind of, reiterating some of the points that Dorothy and Eva have been making. Now, Andrea has been working at the nexus of business and biodiversity for years. So while some people think, okay, business and biodiversity are completely two different things that have no relationship, Andrea has been right at the center of that for a really long time. And so because of that, I'd love to get your thoughts, Andrea. What are the trends that you are seeing in terms of how businesses are responding to nature? And what do you think is driving this shift?
Thanks, Shu. And just to echo what Dorothy has said, it's a false choice between, do you have nature or do you have business and prosperity? I think we're seeing, and this is one of the biggest trends, how the interdependence works between prosperous societies, prosperous businesses, and nature conservation. And that has shifted over the 25 years that I've been working in this field. So thinking back to the early 2000s, really it was seen as maybe an act of charity to invest in biodiversity, or something that was ancillary to the core business model. I think what's happened over the years that I've been working in this field is that there's been a real coming to the center of realizing how biodiversity is core to business operations, and seeing, and I think you've rightly pointed out, the impacts and dependencies which translate into both risks and opportunities for the businesses to grow. My work in the African Wildlife Foundation is really to work with businesses in landscapes where we are operational, to engage them with how they can be part of a story of protecting and restoring the natural systems that their operations relate to. And we operate in 17 different landscapes across 10 different countries across the continent, everything from savannas in East Africa and the boundary zone between the Sahel and the Congo Basin through to Congo Basin rainforests and wetland systems across the continent. What I can say is that the businesses that we engage with are at the table because they see a real opportunity in incorporating how they're addressing risks of degradation through investments in restoration and protection. So just to put a few numbers on the table, 19% of the forest or of the roads in Ghana are at risk from erosion. over 50% of the coastal areas in 3 countries on West Africa's coast, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Togo, are at risk of erosion from the 1.8-meter sea level rise that's happening on an annual basis in that region. Mozambique lost 9% of GDP to floods in 2013. So this is real. It's hitting bottom lines. It's hitting production and the ability to get product to market when it comes to the road infrastructure. And the safeguards are available. So the ways of restoring forest systems so that you can secure long-term water supply, so that you can secure hillsides that are prone to erosion, the mangrove systems that protect coastal areas from inundation and flooding and erosion, are all known strategies that use nature as part of the infrastructure that's required for long-term sustained production. To take an example, we've invested, in fact, in an agriculture production in southern Tanzania, where one of the key risks that they had to the actual production cycle or their business was a lack of pollinators. So here you've got a situation where the forest decline and the erosion of the forest diversity was resulting in a bottoming out of the pollinator species that were required by the avocado farmers in order to increase their production or to sustain their production, which ultimately meant that there were knock-on effects in terms of the export markets and accessing the right windows of timing for export markets. Another case, we've done a lot of work in the agriculture sector where planning for agriculture expansion in places where you have wildlife corridors has resulted in exposure of those crops to trampling and loss that are caused by wildlife. You can easily address those issues, you can address those issues through better land use planning to avoid conflict situations, so that you separate out kind of where the agriculture production happens from the wildlife corridors. But looking at it those are kind of risk management strategies. So protecting one's value chain from a risk management perspective. One of the things that I've seen is also in the years that I've been working in this field is a greater diversification of the sectors who are involved in engaging in biodiversity issues. So traditionally in the African context, a lot of the focus was on the tourism sector because of the close connectivity with spaces and species that are of interest from a tourism revenue point of view. But increasingly, we're getting calls from the agriculture sector, the infrastructure sector, even the ICT sector, to try and understand how their businesses can align with very specific efforts to protect and restore the natural systems that they're part and parcel of. I think some of the drivers behind that are internal in terms of the access to markets and employees, interests, and the need for staying clear with innovation. So we've had companies, for example, in the palm oil sector in particular, that have been affected by the zero deforestation legislation in the export markets that they're targeting in Europe, that are driving investments in understanding how to avoid deforestation risks in their value chain and their supply chains, and that's driving a certain amount of mapping and strategy building in terms of securing better production processes in the farms that are currently in their supply chain. But we've also seen, the African youth that we work with, in fact, really driving a change in expectations of the companies that they source from or that they're part of or that they're working for, that's leading to a great deal of innovation on the continent. So personally, I'm very inspired by what Africa brings to the table in this nature space. I think not only is it the wealth of nature that Africa has in terms of or the wealth and diversity of natural assets that Africa brings to the table. We've done a lot of work to map that out in studies like the Zimbabwe Biodiversity Economy study that we've produced. And that the African Leadership University has scaled that kind of approach across the continent in terms of mapping out really what the natural asset brings to the bottom line in terms of GDP, and it's very clear that it's core as an asset base. But really, I think Africa holds the key to innovation. I mean, there's this chance to demonstrate how you can follow a different path to development and growth and achieving growth aspirations than what sort of that traditional path has been highly exploitative, and then ultimately ends in a situation where you need to have a lot of restoration activities, backfilling the damage that was done through the growth trajectory.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You touched on a lot of really, really interesting points. For example, the deforestation part reminds me of the EU deforestation regulation that you mentioned, which I think a lot of African businesses don't know about. For those of you who don't know, so this is a regulation that would be affecting not only companies in the EU, but all companies across the world for 7 commodities. So it was coffee, cocoa, so many others. And because of this new regulation, they're not going to be able to export their commodities to the EU. So I think that's one of the ways where we're seeing regulation affecting African businesses across the world. And I love what you said also about we can have a different pathway to development instead of just going with what we expect in terms of traditional methods and then ending up having to spend so much money fixing these problems. So now I am going to move on to our second panel, which I am also very excited about. So we are going to be joined by Giovanni from Sappi and Valentine from Safaricom. So Safaricom is focusing on mobile financial services, digital platforms, and connectivity. They have over 49 million customers in Kenya, Ethiopia, and beyond. In fact, when I used to live in Kenya, I had a Safaricom number. So yeah, really great to be learning more about their work. So they have been created a sustainability framework in 2012. And if you want to find out more about that, my colleague will be sharing the link to the Safaricom case study. And then in terms of Sappi, so Sappi is a global leader in sustainable forestry, renewable energy, dissolving pulp, sustainable packaging, and they are serving customers in over 150 countries. And they have also been applying the ACT-D approach, like I mentioned, so assess, commit, transform, and disclose. And you can find out more in the Sappi case study. So representing them is Giovanni, like I mentioned, the General Manager for Sustainability and Technology Center at Sappi Southern Africa. And then we have Valentine, who is the Manager for Climate and Environmental Compliance at Safaricom. So we can stop sharing the screen now and can bring on our 2 panelists. So thank you, Giovanni. And Valentine, please feel free to put on your video. And we will go straight ahead. So I'm going to start with you, Giovanni. Now, in your case study, you have mentioned that you have models from the Global Change Institute in South Africa. You've had materiality assessments. You're using the LEAP approach from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures that Eva had mentioned initially, and this helps companies identify and manage their nature-related risks and opportunities. And while this is really commendable, I think companies that are still early in their nature journey might think, do we have to do all that? Do we have to use all these tools and all these frameworks? And I find that some of them are quite intimidated by the number of resources available. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you manage just the number of resources out there? And then how did you decide which ones to use for you to know what priority actions to take?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. What an awesome experience to listen to all of you as well. I'm going to start by making an admission. So I am new, but not really new to the sustainability space. I was a forest scientist for 30 years, before a year or so ago moving into the space. The question you asked about, how many of these frameworks, these methodologies, these resources are out there. It's extremely complex. It's quite difficult. And I must say, right at the beginning, I started to feel that way. But what I would like to share with all of you is that all of these frameworks and methodologies that are put forward are actually quite logical in how they work. They approach a problem or an issue in a way that actually a normal person on the street would approach or decide how they're going to deal with an issue. So most of them will follow a step to go, or the idea to go out and work out who are my stakeholders. What are the issues that are important to those stakeholders? And if I say issues, what are the risks that they see to do with this issue? What are the opportunities that they see to do with these issues? So you would need to go and understand that. You then need to quantify these things. You then go around and you prioritize what are the most important ones. You put certain plans in place to be able to address whatever these issues are. You then need to track how you're doing against these plans as well. All the way along, you need to share with all of the stakeholders how you are going with the process. And if you want to call that LEAP, if you want to call that Act D, whatever you would like to call it, it's actually generally a very similar process that you're following. So maybe just the word out there, don't become despondent. Generally, if you follow sort of almost any one of these processes, they become almost interchangeable. And there's a lot of work being done out there to try and make these things more and more interchangeable. What I do want to caution, and I think I'm talking particularly here to people on the African continent, what I would like to caution in this space is that the metrics, the data that is used in many of these places, this is our challenge in Africa. Okay, so I'm going to use an example. I'm going to put two examples forward to you. So you mentioned the EUDR previously, European Union Deforestation Regulation. What you have there is before you can export your product, you have to go through a due diligence process. You go through all of it, but there is going to be some implementing authority sitting in Europe, be it a customs official, somebody like that, that is going to go and have a look. Did you deforest? And they're going to compare the location of where your product came from. They're going to go and compare that to some default data set. And if the data set for your country or your area or your industry is not accurate, if you don't have a good one in your country that is, let's try and remember these ones, locally relevant and internationally recognized. If you do not have those data sets, they're going to make wrong decisions. You can always argue and talk your way around that, but it's going to hold you up. You could end up with demurrage costs to do with shipping, etc. So the biggest thing is actually not all the sustainability frameworks, etc. It's around which metrics you go and you abide by. When are you going to, when the opportunity comes to advocate, to have input into certain metrics, we need to take advantage of that. Maybe the last one as an example over here is if you take deforestation or nature metrics as another nature metric as an example. One of it would be if you are operating in a place that is all natural forest, okay, then one of the metrics they would use is something called forest fragmentation. They don't want you don't want major forest fragmentation because you want nature and animals to be able to move animals, whatever it be, move unimpeded. If you come to the situation that we have in South Africa where we have planted trees on previously degraded grasslands, okay, that are not suitable for agriculture, we have physically gone and planted trees over there. In that instance, we actually want the measure to be as fragmented as possible, which is completely the other way around, because we want the 30% of land that we leave aside for nature, we need those to be eco pathways for genetics to be able to flow, be it animals, be it whatever the case is. So again, being careful about the metrics and actually standing as a group together and advocating against certain of these issues. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it really, really does. And this is why we called it practical insights from African businesses, because I think it's a very good point you mentioned about thinking about which metrics you're looking at and the applicability to your specific jurisdiction. Now I am going to move on to Valentine. So Valentine, again, please feel free to put on your video. So my question to you is, since Safaricom is a technology company, a lot of people would be surprised that Safaricom is prioritizing nature, because there would be this assumption that Safaricom is, I mean, the Safari is only in the name, you know, so nature should not be anywhere else in terms of corporate decisions. So there's this expectation that since technology companies probably don't interface that much with nature, why are you prioritizing it? So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. Why is Safaricom thinking about nature? And what have you found helpful in terms of assessing your impacts and dependencies on nature and deciding which steps to take?
Wow, that's a big question. And thanks so much, Sho, for having me here. And on behalf of Safaricom, we are very, very, very grateful for the opportunity accorded to us. So as most of you may know, Safaricom is a leading telecommunication company here in Kenya and even in Africa, with a vision to be purpose-led technology company by the year 2030 in Africa. So back to your question, though, that question has been answered somehow by the earlier presenters. So in terms of what motivated Safaricom to be in this space, given that there is that analogy that telcos don't interact, or there is barely minimal interaction with nature, I will tell you for sure there's a lot that in terms of the interaction between telcos and nature. And I'll give you an example. So telecommunication infrastructure interacts with nature, and every installation would mean that there's need for clearance of vegetation for that installation to happen. So in one way or the other, you are interfering with nature. Say, for example, the laying of the fiber cable. So you're passing through nature for that to happen, to connect homes, to connect businesses, to ensure that there's that connectivity. So how do you ensure that as you do connection, as you do installation, the aspect of integrity of the environment, the protection, the conservation of the environment is adhered to? So as a business, we interface or interact with nature in so many ways other than the installations. When it comes to consumption of resources, say, for example, water, we draw water from the environment for us to, say, for example, run some activities around cleaning, gym and the like. So we have a KPI to ensure that we minimize the amount of water that we are drawing from the environment, so that we make this resource available to others. At the same time, also to cut the cost that goes into the purchase of the same resource. Take also an example of energy consumption. We rely so much on energy to power our base transfer station and also data centers, which basically requires a lot of energy to ensure that there's cooling, there's processing of data and a lot of that. And you realize that if you look at our carbon footprint data, a lot of carbon emissions comes from the energy that we consume. Like 90% is barely coming from, is majorly coming from energy consumption. So we do interact with nature in so many ways, and there's need for us to ensure that as we carry out this business, there's need to ensure that we protect nature, we conserve nature, so that it is available. The resources that are currently being consumed can also be made available for the future generation. So our motivation is to ensure that we build a sustainable business. This is a business that takes care of nature, a business that takes care of people, so that it can be able to be sustainable in the long run. We have a lot of risks as a business as we carry out these operations. So there's need for us to ensure that we mitigate risks. And to mitigate risks, it's important that we look at how we are impacting on nature. For example, waste management arising from electronic waste, because we do generate a lot of electronic waste arising from mobile devices, the boosters that we install and all that. So how do we ensure there's proper and responsible disposal of e-waste, so that the nature is protected and all that? So other than mitigating the risk, there's also around ESG requirements, whereby most of the investors are now very, very very keen to understand how businesses are managing environment and social and the likes, for them to use that data to determine whether they should invest in that business or not. So for us, investing in nature is very critical to make sure that we are addressing those risks that are arising from investor requirements. The other thing, of course, is economic benefits. When you invest in nature, I'll tell you for sure, you are then able to reduce on the cost of operations. You are then able to innovate, come up with innovations that are then able to address environmental issues. And from that, you're not only addressing the social problem, but you're then able to generate income that will contribute to your bottom line. In terms of the standards that we use, or the procedure that we used for us to be able to determine what are our impacts on nature, what our dependencies on nature, is that the GSME, which Safaricom is a member of, recently developed guidance, a nature guidance for the mobile industry. So it guides the operators in terms of how do you assess your impacts, your independence on nature, and how do you go about setting the targets, and also what are some of the initiatives that you can put in place to ensure that you mitigate those risks and all that. As a business, we have an ambition to be nature positive by the year 2050. So we want to ensure that we put more positives into nature than what we are drawing from nature. Thank you, sir.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Valentine. I love that you made it very, very clear that technology is dependent on nature, and you were able to show the specific ways in which those dependencies exist. So I'd actually like to go back to Giovanni. I'm curious, is investment sustainability-linked investment also something that you are seeing as well? So Valentine had mentioned that investors really care about how sustainable, especially environmentally sustainable, the business is. Is this something that you're seeing as well?
So I'm going to try and, or maybe I can broaden it, the investment. Let's broaden that topic a little bit. So to stay in business, you do need to sort of take cognizance of the concerns of, again, stakeholders, be they your financiers, be they your shareholders, be they your markets. Everybody is interested, be they your internal staff. So just to touch on that, in the financial markets, it is now a very regular occurrence. You go to take a loan, you go to take a bond. In many instances, you will have ESG related targets that are allocated or associated with the rates that you're going to end up paying back on. So we are having to report annually to various financiers. Why have you not reached your water target that you set for yourself? Or why have you not reached your emissions target that you set for yourself, etc.? So hugely important. However, the business in particular that we are in is directly linked to nature. So, we're a forestry company, I highlighted earlier, based on tree farms or plantations rather than on natural forests. So for us, we grow the trees. We also process making pulp, making paper, making products that in many instances are lovely substitutes for things that are often not so good for nature, alternatives that are not so good. And in order for our business to be able to move forward, because we're so tightly linked to nature, we have to implement and put things in place. Now, I'll give you an example. You get sustainability pressures to reduce your emissions and reduce your water usage. So we, a couple of years ago, made a major investment in one of our big manufacturing facilities where we upgraded what you call your recovery system. So it's the system where after you have cooked the wood to make pulp, you get chemicals and you get the bits that you don't want from the wood coming out in those chemicals. We have a process through which you actually recover all the chemicals to use again in your process, and you burn the organic material, the parts of the tree that you don't want, they're burned for energy. We upgraded the system. What it actually meant is we could increase the production rate of our mill. Okay. At the same time, we significantly reduced our emissions. We increased the level of energy self-sufficiency for our business and increased the level of, or reduced the CO2 emissions. So when we talk about investment, what we are seeing more and more is a little bit of push from a sustainability or a nature point of view often turns out to be a very profitable, you get a very profitable result at the end. So the answer is yes, it is important to our investors, the business that we're in, the market. We're fortunate in a way, it's a bit of a hook. The market is after products from renewable resources. You know, that's a very good thing for us. Shareholders are interested in it. If we don't take care of it, you know, again, our forests are dependent on the nature, they're dependent on the soil. And if we don't look after things, we don't look after that natural ecosystem around them, we will not have the raw material to put into our factories, and our shareholders will not be very happy with that. So it is absolutely 100% ingrained in what we do. We do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for our business. Don't know if that helps a little bit.
100%, 100%. So my last question for both of you actually is looking at how you are supporting other businesses. So for example, Safaricom, you are using your technology to tackle human-wildlife conflict. And Sappi, you are developing new genotypes of trees that require less water. Now, this is super cool, great innovations. But some would also say, well, Sappi, I mean, this is a very big company. They have thousands of people. And Safaricom is responsible for about 5% of Kenya's GDP. So I think there's this assumption that sustainability is a focus only for the bigger companies. So I would love you both to respond to that. How are you working with smaller business to help them become more environmentally sustainable?
Christina, would you like to go first? Or Valentine,
Yes,
sorry.
I can. Yes, I can go first. And thanks, Sho, for that question. And I want to say that from the onset, that sustainability is a responsibility of everybody, be it small business, be it an individual or big business. Because if we look at our individual contributions to environmental degradation, we realize that we have a responsibility to ensure that we address that. So how are we as Safaricom supporting communities to ensure that we are tackling this issue of sustainability? One way in which we are doing that is through trainings. If you look at what we are currently doing with our suppliers, because we would like our suppliers to do what Safaricom is doing. If it is addressing issues around decarbonization, we would like to see that they are doing the same. They are embedding renewable energy and the like. So to get that done, there's need for awareness, there's need for training. So every year we assemble and we are then able to cascade our strategy and also some of the decarbonization levels that we have adopted for them to see the importance of it and all that. And we are looking at even going further to see that we embed these requirements or during the onboarding process so that whoever we onboard share the same vision or goal as Safaricom. The other thing that we do is, of course, supporting businesses, small or large, in terms of if they have an idea that they think would require Safaricom support in terms of coming up with an innovation. Say, for example, what we are doing with Takani Mali, which is a plastic recycling company. They would like us to have a smart receptacle for waste management that can inform their decisions, their operations, and the like. So what we did is that we have embedded IoT into the bins that collect waste, and that bin is then able to collect data in terms of the frequency at which people are disposing waste, waste is being collected and the likes, so that they can then use that information to make decisions to improve on the efficiency of their operations, among others. If you look at what we are doing with Vodacom and other organizations, Vodafone rather, not Vodacom, is that we have an initiative around human-wildlife conflicts. How do you address that? Because with climate change becoming more and more rampant and causing more damage, say, for example, because of drought, you are finding animals moving out of their zones and going to homestead to look for food and the like. So how do you ensure that there's harmony, there's coexistence between people and animals? So what we've developed is a technology solution that can detect an animal coming from the back all the way to homes, and it can send a signal to to community to say, hey, here is an animal coming, so don't go out and the like. So we have an opportunity to work with many organizations. I've just given a few examples, but we give an opportunity to everybody who has an amazing idea or a small idea for us to elevate that to be something that is impactful. Yeah, back to you, Shaw.
That sounds amazing. Love it, love it, love it. Giovanni?
So, yes, you or not, yes, no. It is because we have our big multinationals. That isn't the only reason that we can do these things. There are many opportunities, many ways in which, and I'm going to rely on the industry from which we come, call it the growing space. There are many opportunities for smaller growers to be able to participate and still make a sustainability, nature positive difference. There are ways that we assist, there are ways that we do things to assist them, but there are also ways that they can do these things on their own. So I'll just start a little bit. As a company, we purchase approximately 2 million tons of wood from third parties in South Africa. These parties range from what we would call a commercial farmer right down to subsistence level farmers. We have a program that we set up about 30 years ago in South Africa called the Khulisa program, or the Grow Together program. At this point in time, there are approximately 4,000 small-scale farmers involved in this process. 4,000 farmers with bits of, pieces of land from 0.5 hectare to 20 hectares. With these farmers, we provide them financial assistance to be able to plant the trees. We provide them with the trees. We provide them with the technical know-how and training to be able to plant the trees. We provide them with a guaranteed market. Probably more importantly is the community around. We provide training to them to not only how to plant trees, but how to start your own business, how to run a small business, how to run a cooperative, how to start a contracting business to be able to do harvesting or planting for your neighbor. So we've got within the Khulisa program, we have a training program, which is called the Ulwazi program, in which, there are thousands of people that are literally trained through that system. That's within our forestry value chain. So in the training that we do, we focus on sustainability. Again, the tree, remember, you planted, it stays in the ground for a long time. So if you do not look after nature, you do not look after what is going on around it, you will lose the investment that you have put on. This is different to forests that have grown naturally. It's an investment you make, and you've got to wait there for 20 years, up to 20 years, 25 years. You could be waiting to be able to see the benefits. You have to do everything properly and look after the land around it. The other bit that we will do in this space in terms of assisting the smaller growers, not only growers, but people working in our value chain. So we have big mills and factories that we use. We have skills programs, we have training programs as well, where we focus not only on getting people into our value chain, but also they can go out and work within the communities that surround them as well. So these skill centers talk to sort of artisanal type things like electricians, plumbers, bricklaying, etc. We then also have a number of programs which we call our ESD programs, or enterprise and supplier development programs, where we assist entrepreneurs to get into things like logistics and get into our value chain in that way. Very sort of detailed training that goes into it, ensuring that people are ticking all the boxes from a call it a social point of view, making sure that all of that works properly. Now, those are all things that this big corporate can do for or do with the people that are around us. However, to be able to, for Africa in particular, to take advantage of the natural capital that we have and to become prosperous as well, I think that there's a lesson that can be learned, and that is you can actually go and do even larger scale enterprises that are built on nature that can be prosperous in the way things are done. We just got to do them differently. We've got to do them sustainably. Now, for smaller growers to get into it, people can form cooperatives. Your cooperatives can also group further to become industry associations. These groups together can work with advocacy. These groups can help them to interact with universities. So that is one of the strongest models we have in South Africa is this collaborative and cooperative model at a sustainability level, which is generally pre-competitive. We then go together to different universities. So industry players, associations go together to universities to get certain work done for us to be able to do sustainability related things. And the best example I have is on climate change. So we, in forestry, again, I mentioned it takes you 20 years to grow a tree. What a lot of people won't realize is probably another 20 years before that in breeding the special tree that you're wanting to grow. So we need to know now what the conditions will look like 40 years into the future. So we need climate models that will be at a local level relatively accurate. So as a group, a consortium, we went to the experts in South Africa to ask them to help us with downscale data, to teach us how to be able to interpret this data, what it means for tree growth going forward. That then can inform how we do our tree breeding. And sitting on those panels in those workshops wasn't just the corporates, the farmers were in there as well, representing the cooperatives. So this is an example where the sustainability, the nature positive, etc., it is accessible, it is doable. People just need to collaborate, they need to cooperate to be able to get this done. So that's probably the biggest message I will give. The last one I want to say is as a big corporate, and I want to say this sort of quite loudly, a multinational which is domiciled in South Africa, which started in Africa, it has grown international. We long ago realized that we are not having a discussion about business versus nature. We're actually having a discussion where we are saying we are here because of nature. We are here to protect nature. Those two work, it's a synergy, they work together. It is never, we've never seen it, and we should never see it as business against nature, business versus nature. I think if you don't look after the one, the other can't work.
There are so many great nuggets from this webinar. I love that. If you don't look after one, the other can't work. This is very, very true and just fundamental to the entire concept of a nature positive economy. So we are now going to move on to question and answer. We're not going to be able to take all the questions because of time, but feel free to get in touch with us and we will support in answering those questions as much as we can. And so let me actually go back to you, Giovanni. So there was a question about Sappi protecting the pepper bark tree, which is endangered. And the person said that while this is commendable, the pepper bark tree is used more for medicine than paper. So they're not expecting this to be a material issue. So could you let us know why Sappi is investing in this?
Because we have a responsibility to the communities that surround us, to the greater natural ecosystem. We have developed internally technology, and I'm going to very quickly go through that, to very quickly propagate and bolster numbers of plants. So that has historically been really focused on commercial gain, commercial interest. All we have done is we have taken this insight, the know-how that we've developed there, and lent it to a cause on our boundary. So the Kruger National Park is where this tree sort of really became problematic. In fact, it had more guards on it in many instances than what rhinos did. And this is, you can go and have a look at that. Simply by applying some of the techniques and the know-how we had developed from a commercial point of view, we were able to very quickly propagate and increase the numbers. So it didn't actually cost a whole lot. All it took was a bit of effort in applying our know-how, and everybody could benefit from it. We've grown that program. It no longer just looks at this pepperbark tree or Wolbergia solitarius. It is now including many of our more rare indigenous trees that you find in the indigenous forests. We have started to do something similar as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Giovanni. Now I'm going to go to Valentine. There was a question that you can take on how are telcos like Safaricom and banks implementing fintech to mobilize impact investment for nature projects?
Thanks, Shaw, for that question. We have a number of use cases for M-Pesa that we can mention at this meeting. So one of it is around supporting the decarbonization agenda, whereby we have partnered with an organization called 4R Digital to develop a digital solution for connecting buyers and sellers of carbon credits. So instead of sending the proceeds to bank and all that to get to the communities, what we've done is we have embedded M-Pesa. So the proceeds will then be able to be triggered down all the way to communities who are participating in terms of planting trees, using the electric vehicles and the likes. We also have another use case whereby in most of the slums that we have in Kenya, you realize that in terms of the fuel they use is kerosene. So moving them from kerosene to something that is clean and affordable is that we have partnered with another organization that is deploying cylinders and gas to communities. And for that, we have embedded M-Pesa so that you pay according to your ability to pay. So we have a pay to go model for that. And also for waste management, whereby we have plastic minis in our country. So most of the plastics are thrown all over. And to ensure that is addressed is that we have introduced M-Pesa and also loyalty points to see that when you bring in plastic that you've collected, we are then able to reward you, to give you incentives to make you do more and to give us more plastic so that we can recycle. And many other uses. So we have use cases that we can share for the members to appreciate in terms of use of M-Pesa to finance nature initiatives.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Valentine. The last question that I have noted here, and I think I will pass this on to Dorothy, actually. So the question is, despite the positive steps at COP16 in Cali and Rome, how do you see the flow in impact investment from institutional investors ramping up at scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I had started typing, then I realized it was going to be so long. So I'm glad you've asked. So what we see is that it's gradual, but it's not at the scale and speed required to drive what we call impact at scale. We are seeing a renewed interest by, we are seeing quite a renewed interest in investors, and in this particular case, impact investors funding renewable energy projects, conservation finance, the carbon markets. Biodiversity credits hasn't worked too well, but also then regenerative agriculture is of interest. We are seeing a lot from the fintech piece when it comes to, digital kind of payment solutions that can address or attract capital, or can attract or address the issue of transaction costs, especially in relation to climate-related solutions or nature-related solutions or climate-based solutions. Of course, then we are also seeing impact investors looking at urbanization projects, urban resilience kind of schemes, climate resilience housing, of course, tying that to biophilic designs, which are essentially designs that take into account the natural environment, etc. But like I said, it's not at the speed or the scale required. There are challenges. Of course, they may be impact investors, and so they're able to put in what you call patient capital. But still, African markets are quite high risk. Or rather, let me use this term that we say a lot. There is the risk perception and there is the risk reality. And of course, African markets are regarded as high risk. I think I want to share examples of, certain transactions that we are seeing. You see a transaction like in the DRC market, which was almost getting to final stage. Then suddenly there's a political instability challenge, and suddenly, everyone has to pull out, and, projects need to stop, and funding or investments need to cease, just, taking a watch and wait attitude. And so just that aspect of risk, sometimes risk could be perceived, but there many times is a reality, political instability, regulatory uncertainties, of course, there's a currency volatility issues. And then one thing that we see, especially when we are working within Anchor, where we have a number of financial institutions, and then we also have project developers and project implementers. And we see there's a mismatch between, what investors are looking for, and in this case, impact investors are looking for, and the bankability or investability of projects, And so one of the ways we've tried to address this is to set up an accelerator, a nature or carbon accelerator program, which seeks to look at projects, or rather seeks to take on a number of projects within a certain period and get them to investor readiness, and also provide different levels of support, including, showcasing opportunities for matchmaking and all that. But that still remains a challenge which, needs to be addressed. And that's part of the reason why I'm saying the scale is not as it should be. In terms of possibly thinking about how it would look like in future, when I look at it based on the work that we're doing, the engagements we are having with the investors, and the engagements we are having with project developers and project implementers, and the engagements that as Anchor we are having with regulators, we expect a bit more of pilot type deals for the next maybe 1 to 2 years. And again, it's also because there are many accelerators that are also being set up. I mean, we are running a carbon accelerator. I know various accelerators, nature accelerators, bioeconomy type accelerators that are, are actually filling this market. And with time, in a few years, then we expect to see, more investor-ready projects. And so
Right.
we expect to see a little more going forward. And then in the longer term, then you expect to see more, or the larger African, maybe pension funds or sovereign wealth funds or insurance companies being active impact investors over time.
Yeah, and I love it because we have been talking about opportunities, and you just mentioned, this this carbon project accelerator. Giovanni spoke about how they are supporting small businesses. Valentine spoke about how they are supporting innovators. So I feel like there are specific things that can be done for people to also take advantage of the opportunities that come with the nature transition. So we are already at time, actually. So we can just put up the very last slide that just shows the websites of each of the organizations. But generally just want to say thank you so much to everybody for joining. If you have any other questions or would like to get in touch with us, please do so. We have included our emails in the chat, and then everybody who has registered will also be getting a summary and the recording from this webinar. So thank you everybody so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.